What did Helen Keller's parents do to punish her whenever she used dirty language? They washed her hands with soap. Take you a while. These are all very special. How do you get Helen Keller to keep a secret? You duct tape all her fingers together. But this one's going to throw you. Why couldn't Helen Keller play on her high school football team? Because she was a girl. Okay, now I got to tell you something really cool about Helen Keller. Did you know that she was a very spiritual woman? Very wise woman. I've read some of her writings, and I'm amazed by that lady. It is true that she, since she was a baby, could not hear anything, couldn't see anything, and I'm sure you all know the story about how Anne Sullivan came into her life and began to teach her sign language, and it was quite a challenge. She had no way of communicating with anybody. She was just wild. She was out of control, and understandably so. She was in a world of darkness and silence and a world of fright and fear. And she slowly began to learn sign language, and she actually did learn to speak, and speak really well. And on one occasion, she met with a prominent minister from that time whose name was Phillips Brooks. And I want to show you on the screen a quote and the setup to that, because this is where you're going to see Helen Keller. Blindness, deafness, spiritual blindness, spiritual deafness comes in. When Keller was young, Anne Sullivan introduced her to Phillips Brooks, who introduced her to Christianity. Keller famously said, when she heard about God, "I always knew he was there, but I did not know his name." I'm pausing to let that sink in. Nobody had ever told her or been able to tell her. And yet, although she was physically blind and physically deaf, she was spiritually, she had keen insight. It's not so much eyesight as it is insight. And in terms of hearing, she was picking up on some reality in her quiet, dark world that she knew was real, but she just didn't know what to call it. That's pretty interesting. There are different forms of blindness and deafness, and I hate to think about what it would be like to be blind or deaf, but there are a couple of things that for me would be much more devastating and rob my whole life of its meaning. You know what that would be? To suddenly become spiritually blind and spiritually deaf. What a dark world this would be without any spiritual insight or guidance or meaning or reason that it all even matters. And so today, our goal is to talk about developing our spiritual eyes, our spiritual insight, how to hear, perceive God. First thing you got to know is seeing and hearing God, and I use that in quotations. A lot of that comes down to a matter of perspective. And I mean the perspective from which you're looking at the whole subject. The attitudes that I already have in my mind made up about God, my beliefs can work for me or they can work against me. Perspective changes everything. Years ago, the New York Museum of Natural History created an exhibit that had to do with perspective. It was the most peculiar thing I've read about recently. They set up this one room in the museum that was intentionally set up and designed to show you and let you experience what it's like for your dog to walk into your living room. Has it ever occurred to you that when your dog walks into your living room, they don't see the same things you see? They see some of the same things, but they don't see it from the same perspective. This museum was set up for a 5-10 person to walk in, and everything in the room is raised up proportionally so that you see it from the perspective of your dog. And when you walked into that museum, they say, the first thing you see is the table legs, the legs of the table. But unless you're a Great Dane, what you see is these, what look like columns ascending up into the air. And you can tell there's some sort of flat platform at the top, but you have no idea what's on it because you certainly can't see up that high. Are you starting to get it? In this exhibit about perspective, the mantelpiece over the fireplace looked like a cliff way up high. Again, couldn't see what was over it, what was on top of it, but to your dog, to Ollie, to George, it looks like a cliff. And even the chairs in this exhibit looked like high thrones. And you're not tall enough to see the cushion. You may be able to see the back, and it looks like some high exalted throne that a king would sit on. All I'm saying, get this, the whole point of that was to teach us that none of us see everything in the same way. We all see it from different points of view. And the point of view from which we're looking at anything, any concept, any idea is very dependent, totally dependent on where we're standing, on what our position is. Some things are higher than we've ever climbed. Some things we cannot see from where we stand. Jesus gave us so many gifts. One of the many beautiful things Jesus gave is that Jesus walked through this world seeing and hearing things that the average person did not see and hear. His spiritual vision was 20/10. His spiritual hearing was sharp and crisp, and Jesus noticed things. He picked up on things that other people didn't. One of the reasons for that is that he had such a close bond with God. He said to his Father, you in me, and I'm in you, and we are in them. But just think about that. You, God in me, I in God. That's you don't get any closer than that. And his perception was so sharp that he pointed out things we would never think about. I want to give you a quick example. Jesus said things like, blessed are they that mourn. Now, do you know anybody that's been mourning? Have you been through a grieving time? Because you lost somebody, you lost something, your health, a position, whatever. You know what grief is like? Mourning. When you're in the mourning state, do you see anything good about it? No, because it's like that table that's just a little higher up. Jesus saw it, and he pointed out something I don't think I'd have ever thought about or seen, so to speak. He said, blessed are they that mourn, for they shall be comforted. Blessed are the poor. You ever had a taste of poverty? Presently? In the past? You know what poverty's like? Do you see any blessing in that? Jesus did. Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Jesus saw things in a different way. And was it, now let's get this, was it that Jesus did not see the negative, horrible, painful, sorrowful, tragic things in this world that you and I see? Was it that Jesus just had his blinders on and he was Pollyanna or Mary Poppins and he just thought everything was beautiful in its own way, you know? No. Was it that Jesus didn't see the dark things? Oh, good gracious, no. Nobody ever saw the darkness and evil and pain in this world any more clearly than Jesus Christ. And I'd say that few, if any, have ever experienced anywhere near the level of pain, darkness, sorrow that Jesus himself experienced firsthand. He knew all about that. He saw it. He heard it. He got it. He saw it all. But that's not all he saw. Do you follow me? It doesn't take a real smart person to walk around in this world and point out all that's wrong. Even kids can do that, and they do. Especially when their perspective is a sour push negative one because something didn't go their way. Mama's bad. The teacher's bad. Nobody likes me. Everybody hates me. I'm just going to go eat some worms, you know. I mean, that's the way. It doesn't take a real smart person to look around and see there's a lot of bad stuff in this world. A lot of discouraging stuff. A lot of dark stuff. Jesus saw that. I'm sure you see that. My question is, are you able to see more than just that? Are you able to see the rest of the things that are there? Are you able to see the blessings along with the griefs? Are you able to see the bright things right along mixed in with the dark shadows? Jesus did. Jesus did. That's how he taught us to look. It's not like you have to choose which world you're going to look at. Am I going to just look at nothing but the positive things that reinforce my faith and make me feel good. No. Don't do that. That's self-deluding. You don't help anybody with that. Also, you don't have to choose, though many do. This is actually more common, to just focus on all that's bad, all the bad things that can happen and probably will. It's all there. Do you have eyes to see it, though? Is your heart open enough? As your spiritual eyes begin to open, it really is a conversion process. It's a transformative process because you begin seeing beautiful things, godly things, spiritual realities that previously were just above your field of sight. They were like that table so high you couldn't see the Thanksgiving feast sitting on it, awaiting you. Jesus said, what was it? Matthew 5:8, blessed are the pure in heart, for they shall see God. Blessed are the pure in heart, for they shall see God. Now, let's clear up a couple of very common misconceptions that will strip that verse of all its meaning and application unless you see this. First of all, when he says they shall see God, the first assumption I remember making, or that most people would make, well, the pure in heart, that's the people who are real good, and they never do anything wrong, and because they're pure in heart, one of these days they're going to die, and they're going to go to heaven, and they're going to see God. Well, that may be true, but that's not what Jesus was talking about. All the Beatitudes are about this world. The pure in heart will see God here and now. See, a pure heart is one that's undivided. A pure heart is one that's open to everything. A pure heart is one that's not contaminated with, oh my goodness, you know what will stop up your eyeballs and prevent you from seeing God at work in the world around you? Resentment. I know that firsthand. I spent way too much of my life angry and resentful. When I'm like that, all I see is what's bad and what makes me matter. And the last thing I'm seeing is God. Unforgiveness will do it. Also, another thing that can block a heart, contaminate a heart, is an obsession with getting something. And that becomes all we see and all we can think about. That'll block an otherwise pure heart. So a pure heart is basically an open heart, a clear heart. It's wiping all the gunk off the glasses. Pure in heart will see God. And obviously the second thing I got to say about that, when he says they shall see God, does he mean that if you're pure in heart, you're going to see God himself or herself, whatever God is, walking out in front of you on the road, and so you have to swerve to miss him as if he's Bigfoot or something? No. Jesus of all people knew better than that. What does the scripture say? No man hath literally seen God at any time. Even Moses didn't see God. He saw where God had just been, which you've heard me say this before. Rarely do we ever see what God is doing when he's actually doing it. It's usually in retrospect as we look back. As Moses finally looked back and he saw the train of the robe. We don't usually see God when he's actually right there doing something. We see where God has been. Can you look back over your life and see where God has been. Like Jacob, who had never had any experience with God because he didn't give two hoots in Jamaica about God. His heart was not pure. His whole obsession, his heart was totally focused on greed and the accumulation of wealth. And one night, he slept with a head on a pillow, with his head on a stone for a pillow. Had a strange experience, spiritual experience, where he didn't see God, but he saw this in his dream. He saw a vision of a ladder to heaven. And when he awoke the next morning, what were the first words he said? Jacob said, God was in this place, and I knew it not. Truth is, God is in every place. He's in every life, in every seat, in every home. Why are some homes so bad then? Well, it's not that he's not there. It's that he's not being noticed or followed or consulted or allowed much influence. But God is in every place. But Jacob did not see it. And my goal is to train myself to see and recognize. The poets sometimes say things better than any preacher. Elizabeth Barrett Browning, one of my favorite lines from her, she said this: earth's crammed with heaven. See, heaven and earth are not two entirely separate dimensions with no overlap or nothing to do with each other, as some people seem to think. A whole lot of Christians seem to think there's heaven and there's earth. There's the spiritual and there's the physical. And those are like two entirely separate things. No. God is in all. What does Paul say? In him we live and move and have our being. Earth is crammed with heaven, and every common bush afire with God. But only who sees takes off his shoes. The rest sit around and pluck back blackberries. You know, there's an old Jewish legend, I may have told you. You know, the story of Moses and the burning bush. The bush that burned caught his attention. The legend is that several other potential Moses figures had seen that same bush or a similar bush that God placed in their pathway to grab their attention, to get them to take off their shoes, open up their hearts, unstop the ears of their mind, and listen to something that was actually pretty disturbing. I've got a job to do that may kill you. But the old legend says many had passed the bush, but Moses was simply the first one to stop, turn aside, look, and listen. All right, how am I going to wrap this up? I got to say this. Learning to see God, quotations, is a process, okay? And it starts with surrender. And that could take the form of anything in all the world, any idea, any attitude in all the world that would or could block your view or stop your ears. And I'm talking, that can happen whether you're Christian or not Christian. Christian. I remember being told by a wise old man. He was 90 years old and 85 or something like that. And he was a member of our church. And I remember specifically he telling me, now God doesn't speak anymore. He only did that in Bible days. And miracles don't happen anymore. God's given us doctors. And that was his belief. Okay, is he likely to see God? Not as likely, because there's a block there. Any assumption that you operate with and have for a long time, wherever you got it, maybe if you just concluded it on your own, that can block you from seeing what's already there. So it starts with surrender. And surrender means, hey, maybe there's a few things I don't know. Is that possible? Maybe there's some things I don't know. Maybe there are some things in this world that are real, but I've not yet encountered them. Maybe what I encountered was the counterfeit of it. And so I concluded it was all counterfeit. I mean, I know when I've encountered counterfeit religion, first thing it does in me, or it used to do in me, I'll say this, is bring up doubt about all religion, because I was an all or nothing thinker, which all kids are. You know, if one part is bad, the whole thing's bad. Okay, that's the way kids think. Be adults. Open surrender to the reality. There may be things and realities around me that I've not yet experienced. And right now, that's all I'm asking you to do. Just open and let God do the rest. I know that Paul, the apostle, was originally Saul. Nobody ever hated Christianity worse than Saul. He was out to destroy it. And one day on the road to Damascus, he had this experience where he was temporarily physically blinded. It turned out to be a conversion, and it said, as he arose to his feet, scales, as it were, scales fell off his eyes. You know what that's talking about? Whatever those scales were, perhaps physical, but they were darn sure mental scales. They were spiritual scales that did not want to see certain things. The last thing on the earth Saul wanted to see or believe was that Christ was real. That was the very thing he did not want to believe. Scales fell off, but he did not immediately become an apostle. You know what he did? The voice said, go into the village. There's a man who's going to teach you. And then go away to Arabia for 3 years. There's a lot you got to learn, and there's a lot you got to unlearn. It's going to be a process. It starts with surrender, openness, when the scales come off. But here's the thing. When the scales first come off and we first begin to see, that doesn't mean that we're going to understand everything we're seeing. And I got to give you this illustration to close with. This is a true story. 100 years ago, over 100 years ago, doctors began successfully performing cataract surgeries on people of all ages. Until then, a person whose eye was covered with a cataract, they were eventually blind. And actually, there were people in the old days, apparently, who'd had cataracts since they were babies, and they'd never seen anything. And so this one doctor wrote a book, and the title was Space and Sight. And here's what he discovered. He discovered that people who were born blind, they'd never seen, when they got their eyesight back, they could see all the same stuff that you and I see, but here's what's so crazy. Not crazy, interesting. They had no perception of size, depth, distance, or shape. One man woke up, seeing for the first time. And do you know this? He was absolutely baffled by the size of his room. Who knows what he thought it was like or how big he thought it was, but it was way bigger than he ever dreamed. And he actually took his shoe off, tossed it across the room, and began walking toward it, trying to get some sense of distance. You know what he was doing? He could see, but he still had to learn to see. And another person was tested before his surgery. The doctor handed him a child's ABC block, you know, those wooden blocks with the letters on them. Handed it to the blind man, and so he did what a blind person does. He immediately began to feel the angles, and he put it in his mouth, and he touched it with the tip of his tongue. He could feel the angles, the texture, even the taste and smell. Then after the surgery, when he had perfect vision, the doctor pulled out that same block, but wouldn't let him touch it. Wouldn't let him touch his tongue to it or taste it. And the doctor said, you know what this is? No earthly idea. Didn't know what it was. And yet, he did know what it was. And when the doctor actually handed it to him, and now he's looking at it with his eyes and touching it with his tongue, it's that block. And that brings me back to what Helen Keller said. Hearing about God the first time, I always knew He was there, but I never knew His name. You know His name. You know His name. Do you know He's there? Learning and discovering that is a process. May we all enter deeper into that.